there's a long-standing bias against directly studying sexuality and caring about people's sexual experience in medicine. And that has resulted in a lot less study on the vulva and the clitoris than the other parts of this system. So it's really both a a lack of prioritizing it, and I would say a prudishness and squeamishness, even among doctors. I've heard a lot of stories after writing this article that doctors have talked about people's downstairs cancer or their down there problem, which is an incredibly vague and euphemistic way to refer to body parts that, again, billions of people have. So even doctors who are supposed to be kind of like objective and specific and scientific are often shying away from using accurate language. And that just muddies the water for everyone.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Rachel Gross. Rachel's an award winning science journalist based in Brooklyn. She's the author of Vagina Obscura, an anatomical voyage, published in 2022. It tells the story of how early anatomists mapped the female reproductive system and how a new generation is wresting them back. Rachel has edited Smithsonian Magazine and written a column for BBC Future. And in 2019, she was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, where she studied reproductive biology, gender, and the history of science. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Wired, New Scientist, and Slate, among others. Her recent story in Nautilus was Why Doctors Can't Name Female Anatomy. A vulva by any other name causes confusion and unnecessary suffering. Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Brian, thanks so much for having me.
To start off, could you summarize your intellectual and academic background and say a bit about how the subjects are capturing your journalistic curiosity today?
Sure. I've been a science journalist for more than 10 years now. I've worked at, Wired Magazine, Smithsonian Magazine, Slate. I've covered many beats within science, including kind of the fights within fundamental religion and evolutionary theory, climate change, um, kind of religion and science in general. But for the past 4 years or so, I've focused a lot on the science of the female body, on the history of gynecology, and on the really massive knowledge gaps we have when it comes to half the bodies on Earth. So a lot of my work now looks at gender and bias in medicine and kind of traces back those knowledge gaps and why there's so many questions we haven't asked when it comes to bodies that have vaginas and uteruses and clitorises.
What drew you initially to wanting to write about scientific topics? And was that a very early interest of yours, or was it something that came up later?
Yeah, very early. My parents are all scientists. So my mom's a doctor, my dad was a physicist, and my stepmom is a molecular biologist. So it was kind of just like the water we swam in my household. We used to listen to the audiobook of like the real science of Jurassic Park growing up. And I just always thought of scientists as kind of these really quirky, flawed, endearing human nerds that were kind of my people. And so I really got into science writing as a way to write about scientists, which I think is a bit different than some people. I love the wonder and awe of science and kind of think of myself as like a Miss Frizzle of the female body. But it was really scientists that got me interested. And I did study like English literature, later studied science journalism. So I always loved to write, but I think science gave me a way to write about discovery and really interesting intellectual debates and these bigger questions about being human that um, I felt like were a universal way into a field that people often found kind of intimidating or remote.
Totally, I'm right with you on that wavelength. Once again, your new story in Nautilus is Why Doctors Can't Name Female Anatomy. Could you give us a brief summary of that story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been writing a lot um, about basically the science of reproductive and sexual organs. So again, like the vagina, the clitoris, the uterus, the ovaries. And one really big problem is that we have no good language for a lot of these parts. For instance, we often say the reproductive system or female reproductive system, and even that is pretty biased and like a really narrow lens. First of all, these organs are doing a lot more than reproduction. Whether or not you decide to get pregnant if you have these organs, or whether or not you can, they're in your body for your entire life. They're often super involved in regeneration, immunity, obviously pleasure. And there's this kind of narrow lens that happens when the language restricts how we talk about it. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. I'd also written about this really technical term for the New York Times. It's called pudendum, and it means the part for which you should be ashamed. And it's how doctors often referred to the vulva or the outer female genitals, as we'll get to. Um, and it's in gynecology textbooks everywhere. And like, once again, like there's a lot of bias and assumption baked into this one term. And so I wanted to explore how this affects patients and doctors. So for this article, I was beginning to hear that this word vulva, which I'd thought about a lot, you often hear on like feminist Twitter, like "don't call my vagina a vulva," or rather, "don't call my vulva a vagina." And it's a really important distinction for a lot of people because the vagina is actually the muscular tube that goes from the uterus to the outside, and the vulva is everything on the outside. So it includes like the labia or the lips, the clitoris, the openings to the vagina and the urethra. It's kind of the parts that are involved in sexuality, the parts you can see and touch. And so I knew there was this conversation going on. And then I began to talk to doctors who also had the concern that the vulva was being underused in medicine or it was being misused. And it was actually making it harder to communicate within medicine. It was leading to miscommunication between patients and doctors. And sometimes it was just making it less likely that we would study these body parts, which is obviously a loss for medicine in general. So that's what this story became about. I trace back where we got the word vulva, how it's used in medicine, whether doctors are using it in a standardized way, and if not, who gets harmed, and how does it make healthcare worse for people who have these body parts.
Nice. Why has it been a challenge for doctors and researchers to pin down the different parts of female sexual anatomy?
I'm so glad you asked, Brian. You would think that it would not be so hard because bodies have not changed very much for the past 2 millennia since we've been studying anatomy and medicine. However, as I was writing my book, Vagina Obscura, a lot of researchers told me this kind of idea that's like, you can't see what you aren't looking for, and you see what you expect to find. So even though we're all looking at the same bodies and doctors like basically care for people with these bodies day in, day out, they have a certain focus and they have things that they think are important. And in gynecology, often that ends up being the really reproductive parts. Gynecology is the field that's concerned with women's bodies and bodies with this anatomy. And really, what they care about is fertility and infertility. Are you pregnant? Do you want to be? Do you not want to be? Cancer, they're going to give you a pap smear, STDs. And that's usually about it. So all the other stuff that the vulva is involved in, again, like protection, a lot of like the vulva, the vaginal microbiome are sort of an extension of your immune system, which is really important. And again, they're involved in pleasure and sexuality, which your gynecologist really doesn't ask you about. So there's a long-standing bias against directly studying sexuality and caring about people's sexual experience in medicine. And that has resulted in a lot less study on the vulva and the clitoris than the other parts of the system. So it's really both a a lack of prioritizing it, and I would say a prudishness and squeamishness, even among doctors. I've heard a lot of stories after writing this article that doctors have talked about people's downstairs cancer or their down there problem, which is an incredibly vague and euphemistic way to refer to body parts that, again, billions of people have. So even doctors who are supposed to be kind of like objective and specific and scientific are often shying away from using accurate language. And that just muddies the water for everyone.
Do you think they do that out of some sense of like respecting the patient and like not wanting to offend the patient, or like what is the kind of source of that?
Yeah, so I do think that's part of it. So I talked to like sexual health experts that say that most of their patients have never had their vulva examined, even though there's a lot of kind of skin conditions or even conditions of the clitoris that are worth looking at some point throughout your lifetime by a doctor. And, patients can be very uncomfortable with that part of their body too. A lot of them apologize when a doctor has to look there. They like say they're sorry for their own anatomy and they don't want to look, they're grossed out. So I think the discomfort does originate in both doctors and patients. So it's just something like deeply embedded in the culture. But going back to med school, when you're learning about gynecology and female bodies, there's just very little focus on that part. Often the clitoris is actually omitted or minimized in textbooks, and just the vulva as a whole is not really pointed out as a clinically important thing that you're going to be looking at as a doctor in most cases. So you get the impression that it's not appropriate or not part of your scope of interest. Um, I've also talked to doctors who they learn a standard pelvic exam in med school, and what they remember being taught about the vulva or clitoris is to avoid it because they don't want to offend the patient. I mean, in an era of Me Too, like people are being as careful as possible, but that often results in kind of this silence around this important part of the body.
Yeah, and that results in certain harms, as you alluded to earlier in the piece. I think you mentioned that some women will opt for cosmetic surgeries of the labia, if I'm correct, and that can end up removing some very useful nerve endings and stuff, and they're not really informed that that is what is happening.
Yeah, there's a few different types of harms that come out of this. And I do mention labiaplasty because it's one of the fastest growing cosmetic surgeries. And the idea is that it's supposed to trim the labia. And it just relies on this idealized idea of the vulva as being something uh, neat and small. And often people that want it haven't seen that there's a huge variety and spectrum of healthy genitals, and there's generally nothing wrong with theirs if they're getting this cosmetically. But plastic surgeons often don't fully know the anatomy and don't know or don't emphasize that this is very sensitive, important tissue that also protects part of the vulva that are underneath. And it's not just trimming skin, it's removing, like you said, nerve ending, sensitive tissue, and tissue that protects the clitoris, and can result in scarring and pain. Um, Another way that this kind of silence and stigma harms patients is that we are still learning kind of the basic anatomy of the clitoris, which is the primary erectile organ of pleasure for women and other people with clitorises. And that means that we haven't fully mapped it out. And when you have surgeries for urological problems or for after you've given birth and you have prolapse, then you can get harm in that really sensitive area. And I have talked to patients who have lost sensation because of various surgeries that didn't take this anatomy into account. Um, so it's really a serious thing to be getting procedures in a place where there's still medical uncertainty.
You write that the lack of a standard definition for vulva is a window into something deeper. What does it reveal?
I think that it gets at that discrepancy that I mentioned about medicine often considering the female body to be reproductive or, mostly concerned with pregnancy, fertility, infertility. And again, this is like this historic bias. I'm not saying all doctors have it, but the way medicine is set up is to spend research dollars and treat problems of fertility and infertility, not sexuality and your kind of overall health and well-being. And that's what the vulva is about. Um, it's about your day-to-day comfort. It's about the possibility of pain during sexual activity or at other points in your life. And it's about your satisfaction and your sexual experience. And the fact that we can't talk about it in a standard um, scientific way, the fact that there's still squeamishness around it and people are still using these euphemisms and really ridiculous, vague words like down there or nether regions, to me speaks to a lack of regard for those concerns for people with these body parts.
Can you tell us about any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas you came across in your reporting or research that, for whatever reason, you didn't end up including in your Nautilus story? Maybe some stuff you want to highlight from the book?
Oh my gosh, where to start? Well, the fun part of this article is actually looking at the etymology or the history of the word vulva, which, like, that's one thing that I was just like, okay, vulva is the good word. We want to use this because it's more specific than using the vagina to just mean like everything. Um, but it has this really weird history where apparently it probably comes from the Latin for to roll, and it actually is also the basis for the car Volvo. Um, and it's actually all over the Gutenberg Bible, which was fascinating to me. And at that point in the 1400s, vulva referred to like the vagina and the uterus. So again, it's like this nebulous term that's really evolved over time. But I did love that the first mass printed book was full of vulvas. Um, for other things, like in the book, I go way back to like Hippocrates and Galen, these like really classic doctors and anatomists that we've all heard about, and how they looked at the female body and they basically disregarded the clitoris. And they had these really weird idea that the uterus was an inside out penis and the ovaries were internal testicles. And they sort of described the female body as this uh, inferior and more internal version of the male. And Galen actually literally called the female genitals like the eyes of a mole, by which he meant they were kind of like useless and not fully developed. And as a result, the ovaries didn't actually have their own name until the 1600s. They were just called female testicles until then, and doctors didn't know what they thought they made like some form of female sperm, or maybe they did nothing. They were just like some vestigial organ that women only had because men had them. So like these kind of details really gave me a lot of insight into what we cared about within the female body, and so what the lens of science decided to focus on for centuries and centuries. And it gives some insight into why it took so long to get that basic anatomy of the clitoris and the vulva, because it just wasn't important. It wasn't the baby making part of a woman's body, and that was the part that was medically interesting to a lot of these anatomists.
Hmm. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a lot of things, but I'm working on a column about the origins of medical language, so very related, for the New York
Hmm.
Times that's going to start up. And I'm looking at kind of contested words and pieces of language across different fields of medicine and how they affect doctors and patients, and where they came from.
Nice. To close out, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Do you have a website or any social media channels they can follow to keep up with your
Yeah,
work?
absolutely. Please follow me on Twitter at Rachel E. Gross. Wait, sorry, let me try that again. Um, yeah, please follow me on Twitter at Rachel E. Gross. That's RACHELEGROSS. My website is www.rachelegross.com, and my Instagram is gross_out. And I post all my new work. And yeah, please come say hi.
Excellent. Once again, the book is Vagina Obscura, an anatomical voyage, available, I believe, at fine bookstores everywhere. So definitely check that out. And Rachel's been great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for this great discussion, Brian.